So getting humanity to agree on what a common horizon should look like would sort of be an extraordinary and almost impossible task, I think. But progress, I think we all agree that we're all very committed to that. Everyone wants to see the next generation of human beings lives a little bit better of a life than we did, or enters as in a world that's a little more positive and beneficial than the one that we existed in. So let me talk about something like the United Nations Sustainability Goals, right? Why do we even have these, right? If progress is not a fundamental concern of humanity. Humanity 2.0 itself is going to be working hard over the next year to hierarchically rank impediments to human progress and then work collectively to try and remove those impediments. Is progress enough? Is moving forward, is that reason enough to kind of inspire us to continue to overcome challenges? Or do you feel that we need to have some kind of common goal? Or is just removing impediments to human progress enough?
We need to have common goals. It gets us together. There's so many of them. I think there's 17 from the United Nations, right? And having a common goal can actually unite different perspectives to try to achieve it. Now, you might look at there's too many of them, or you might look at there's too few of them, but at least we should have them.
And again, my claim is that you can't have progress without a goal. Otherwise, you're moving forward, but do you know if you're moving forward or backward? Unless you have a goal, there's no way to measure if you are having success. And so from this perspective, I would say probably the first thing to do is to talk about what are the goals of human beings. What does it mean to have true progress? And how do you recognize when something is progressing in a bad way?
And there's so many different elements to that, because I think a goal in India for clean drinking water is not going to be the same goal in the United States. And so clearly it has to be staggered according to different countries' needs. If we're talking about just real tangible goals in terms of healthcare, education, politics, and so on, it would be quite particular to each country, it would seem to me.
Right. Do you think that humanity itself can even agree on a common set of goals? I mean, as you're saying, Delia, I mean, every single particular context has very, very unique priorities. Right. Do you think there's enough commonality between, amongst humans that we could agree that, let's say, eradicating poverty? I mean, I understand principally we would all agree that doing that is a good thing. Now, so as far as identifying what the greatest impediment to eliminating poverty is, and then tangibly uniting as a species to try and tackle that, is that something feasible? Do you think we actually are capable of doing that?
I think that the more particular and material the goals are, the more difficult it will be to have a common agreement on them. And so, for instance, if we say in India, the goal is to have good drinking water for everybody, that's a pretty broad material goal. That's something that most people can say, yes, we know this because the human body has so much water, we need water in order to survive, yes. But if the question starts to become, should we build a well in this village versus that village, that becomes so particular that it may become quite controversial as to where do we plant the well first, how are we going to go about doing it. So I think that it's easier actually to agree on the highest spiritual goals, peace for mankind, greater increase of knowledge, greater compassion for other people. And then the more particular material you become, well, the more difficult it is to agree on those. So again, and this is the approach of the Catholic Church. The first thing I would say we need to do is talk about what are the spiritual goals. And if we can agree on those, it'll help us to discover how do we agree on this. So for instance, we're arguing about the well. If our goal already stated is peace and common understanding, then maybe we'll argue less about whether we have the well here or there, because we know that this supports peace in a deep way.
But I think we're already doing that also.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the initiatives around the world are trying to move towards that, even if it's not been vocalized in that way. I think most people, as you say, would sign on right away to peace in the world and clean drinking water for everybody and so on. And those are the, essentially what the UN Development Goals are trying to do. So I do think that exists. Probably is a question also of trying to get the social conversation to realize the priority of it. Because I feel like this exists at a level of government agencies and religious organizations and so on, but I'm not sure for individual people. Sometimes you feel a little bit helpless. What can I do about it? I live in California. I can't really help the clean drinking water, or I can give money to it, or, and so what are the sort of concrete steps that an average person who might not have those issues can do. Maybe something like that is helpful.
Okay, well, let me ask you, peace in the world. Let's continue with that train. What's stopping us from getting there? Why don't we have peace in the world? We've been at it for a while now, right?
Well, this reminds me of the question that an English newspaper had put out, and they asked people to submit essays. And the question of the essay was, what is the problem with the world? And everybody submitted various essays. And G.K. Chesterton responded with one sentence, I am. Yeah. And I think that's the answer. That any sort of abstraction from our own responsibility, our own family, our life, and our friendship, unless we start at home, there's no way it's going to happen abroad. And so in this case, questions like this, well, if I don't have peace within myself, if I don't have peace with God, I'm not going to have peace with other people. And so at least on the spiritual values, that's definitely the place to begin.
It reminds me of something Pope Benedict said when he was talking about the environment, because of course before Francis, he was actually the Green Pope, and put solar panels on the Vatican and so on, was the first country to reduce their carbon footprint. And one of the things that he said is that the external degradation that we see is a mirror of our internal deterioration, and so that it's a question of developing an interior sense of peace, of clarity, and so on. And that's a really big call.
And I think it's, at some level, is to be honest with ourselves. Like, I agree that it starts internally. You have a sense of peace, but you don't limit to the view, let's say, for a green planet to your yard. You push it all the way out. There's no boundary to it. There's one planet. And when you look at peace, I remember, I think it was in January, I heard from the High Commissioner for the UN, I think the refugees, there was 60-some conflicts in the world and only one stopped, and there's so many. So then why is it that if we all agree that there is that peace ideal out there that we should all strive for, why are we fighting so much? And then I think the answer to that should be that, well, there's a certain set of resources that are finite and we don't agree to share them. And the more I get, the less you get, and there becomes an imbalance. And in that, there's a lot of work to do. And the work is, well, don't stop at just at your family, push it out, see what the consequences are.
And of course, if all you do is increase the number of resources, that's not going to achieve peace. And this is what people think, is that, oh, well, if we increase the number of resources, we can achieve peace and get rid of poverty. But that's not the case, because people are selfish. And so you can increase the number of resources while increasing disparity of the allocation of the resources. And so this is why, in my mind, it always goes back to the interior principle first. Not to say that we should remain on the spiritual principle, but if you don't have that right, then really the material solutions they won't solve anything.
Right. And it becomes very complex as you push it out. Like we heard that yesterday about should we or should we not consume sticks, like the disposable sticks. Chopsticks.
Wooden chopsticks.
And I seem to remember some years ago it was about buy wine with a cork that's plastic instead of real wood. And I don't know whether it's fake news or not, because I didn't follow it afterwards. Then the counter-argument was, no, use it with real corkwood, because the trees, the cork trees in Portugal are cultivated. I mean, you grow them and you keep on rotating them if you want. And in order for them to be able to sustain themselves, well, you need to use the cork. Otherwise, the tree is not going to, they're not going to be able to make a living out of it. So should you not? And you can see the same thing about the sticks. So yeah, we have so many, but if you have a way to build them sustainably, guess what? Carbon sequestration is a tree. That's the best one.
Right.
So then...
And I think Igor's bringing up an important point, which I emphasize. I think for most people, they're being asked to do things and make sacrifices all the time, constantly, right? I stop using so much paper, right? Conserve your water, right? Turn your lights off if you're not in the house.
Don't use plastic bags.
Don't use plastic bags. And I think this is important. I feel if you're going to ask people to make sacrifices, I think there is a finite tolerance people have for that, right? There's only so many sacrifices they're willing to make, day to day. So, is it important for us as kind of a species to identify what are our priorities? What are the primary sacrifices we need to make as individuals to advance the common good? First of all, do you think we have a sense of that at all? And second, do we need to?
I don't think they see it in terms of sacrifice. I mean, I think they just see it in terms of the new way of living, let's say, at least within an American context of recycling and caring for the environment and that kind of thing. I think they take that on, some new things to add into what they were doing previously. But I think the concept of sacrifice or depriving yourself of something so that somebody else might live better is a tough concept to get across in most of the world, right? Because that's not really what our society is going towards. We want to have all the things. And why should I not have them?
So let's go back to World War II context. So after the war, right, after World War II, Western civilization was in tatters, at least in Europe, and they had to kind of come together to rebuild it, right? So there was a great sense of solidarity in that progress, in that process of rebuilding Europe. And out of that, there was a period of peace, and I would say there was a lot of solidarity, and I think resolution that we are not going to do this again, right? And we alluded to this earlier in the day. Maybe we're starting to lose that. Are we losing a sense of urgency, the importance of working together collectively to kind of build up a new and brighter civilization? Is that something that's been lost in peacetime?
I think we lost the perspective. I mean, our generation, I remember my mom would be talking about the war as if it was a real thing. It wasn't abstract at all. Very recently, there was these studies in the US. Apparently, the younger generation don't know what the Holocaust was. And for us, like unimaginable, because it felt so real. Now you have that distance. How do you keep the learnings from it and you grow from it? I think it's not our kids' fault that they don't know what the Holocaust is. It's our fault because we didn't teach them. And because of that, it might not be that evident to figure out how we're going to move forward.
I think that right now there's a lot of artificial urgency, and this is promoted by a shallow way of understanding world history. And so when there was urgency with respect to the Holocaust, there's this urgency to rebuild civilization. These were monumental and fundamental ideals that the human beings were trying to approach. But now people have urgency with respect to very small news items that come and go. And so it's a shallow emotional approach. And I think that in order to have true progress, you have to have a deep sense of urgency because it's a commitment to value.
Because one thing that we're not acknowledging is that, compared to post-World War II, we are now living in a real world and a virtual world. And so I think that there's a real disconnect in terms of urgency or in terms of what's happening around the world, because when you see things on screens, it's less real to you. You're not living through the war. And it's not your parents that lived through the war, and you're not seeing day to day what are the real difficulties, and so you don't have a sense of urgency, or you have a sense of false urgency.
And I think we played with the vocabulary also. Like there are some very, very strong words. Comparing somebody to Eichmann is rather consequential, but we sort of diminished that delta. Yeah. Telling somebody you're a Nazi because you don't agree with him, it's a little bit demeaning what actually really a Nazi was. And because of that popularization of the vocabulary, then it makes the event seem to be banal to some extent.
Yes, yeah.
Well, let me ask you this. This will be my final question. What do you think is the single most important thing for ensuring human progress continues?
Love of Jesus Christ. Absolutely. That's it.
Okay, Father Ezra?
I would go with just love if we want to keep it in a context of non-Christians or outside of even a religious context. For other people, I would suggest it's got to be love of the other. It has to be.
Compassion and dialogue. Communication and trying to understand that somebody else's perspective and striving for it.
Father Ezra, Delia, Igor, thank you so much for being here. This has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.